I'm with Steve Chalke from Oasis Trust. Now, Steve, what is Oasis Trust?
Oasis is a charity that I set up back in 1985, long time back, almost 40 years ago. When I was a kid, when I was 14, I became a Christian one Friday night. And on that evening, wandering home from a youth club at a Baptist church that I used to go to, I decided that when I grew up, I wanted to be a church leader. I wanted to start a school for children who had not good education, not got that opportunity, a house for children who had nowhere to go, who weren't loved and weren't cared for, and a hospital. I got in, told my mum that I'd become a Christian, and that's what I wanted to do. I don't think she had any idea about what I was talking about, nor did I, to tell you the truth. But that became my mission. That became my destination.
Mm.
And Oasis grew out of that. And now, today, in the UK, which is our biggest operation, we employ around 6,000 people. We run 54 schools. We run endless supported houses for young people who are struggling with life. We just, in the last week or two, after 14 years of planning, opened an alternative to a youth jail for young people who fall into the criminal justice system, which is therapeutic. We run churches, community farms, libraries, all sorts of things, and work in several other countries, all fulfilling that original vision.
So, was there a need for a charity like this within the community?
I think that the church's task is to be light and salt in the community where it's found. And I would say that the charity as such wasn't a part of my original vision. So I was wandering home from this youth club where I only went to it because there was a girl I fancied called Mary Hooper. And on that evening, she told me that she'd never go out with me. So I'm wandering home thinking, what's my life about? And then I think, actually, I love the story that this church tells me that I'm made by God. My life has meaning and purpose. And this is what I want to do with my life. So for me, Oasis is the vehicle to express that Christ-centered vision, the vision I was given when I first became a Christian. So setting up a charity rather than a business or anything else, that was just a way of getting it done. In actual fact, Oasis is a whole series of charities now. In the UK, there's an educational one and a community housing one, and a community projects and churches one, and a justice one, and an anti-trafficking one, and various others. And then we work in other countries around the world, so they also have their charities. But the charity is just a vehicle for getting the job done.
Mm. Tell us about some of the projects that you're involved with.
Well, Oasis began, I'll tell you how it began. I've told you the kind of founding story, really. So when I was I went to theological college. That's the first thing. After leaving school, I went and I worked in a factory on a housing estate and set up a youth group alongside a church. Did that for 2 years, worked for another church for a year and a year beyond that, and then went to theological college. Having left that, I studied for 4 years, or perhaps I didn't study for 4 years, but I was there for 4 years at least. And having done that, I went to work for a Baptist church as a youth worker, as the youth minister for 4 years. And just before I was doing that, I got married. My wife's name's Cornelia. And after three and a half years, I said to the church, I love working here. I really did. But I got to leave because I got to set up a house, and I got to set up a school, and I got to set up a hospital. And they were very kind, and they allowed us to leave. They couldn't pay us, but they allowed us for a year to live in the house that I'd occupied whilst I worked for them. They said, you got a year, you got to find your own money, but you got housing for a year, then you're on your own. And so we ventured out, and we figured that the best thing to do was set up a house, because a school was difficult. In fact, my wife, who had the same kind of education as I had, said to me, we can't set up a school. And I said, what's that? And she said, because we don't know very much. And it was true. We weren't particularly bright. And of course, for the same reason, a hospital is a hugely complex thing to begin. So we opted to set up a house. And that was very, very hard. I mean, there's stories that I could tell you about that. I mean, we had no money, no contacts. Nobody was willing to lend us anything or help us. I mean, nobody knew us. But eventually we got this house up and running, which we still run today. It's a safe house. And we take young people who've been abused and let down, and they come and live with us for 6 months, a year and a half, 2 years, and then we rehouse them and resettle them and support them back into independent living, if you like. And my wife, Cornelia, said, why don't we call this house Oasis? Because it's like an oasis in the desert. We're providing oasis for young people who need that sense of oasis. It seemed like a good idea. I set up a charity called Oasis with the help of some friends, and away we went. And everything has grown from there.
Are you seeing real change in the community?
We work in lots of communities across England. We work in some 40 plus communities. We now run 54 schools, so we've got about 33,000 children in our schools. And of course, then there are their families, their parents, their grandparents. We house endless young people around the country. We've begun churches and become responsible for churches that are interweaved with this. It's not that we run churches somewhere and schools somewhere else and houses somewhere else, etc., etc., etc. It's that we know that for a person to thrive, what they need, what I need, is a holistic, integrated approach to life. All the bits of my life need to work for me if I'm going to thrive. And so that's why when we run schools, we try to set up churches to create relationship, to create trust, to create a change in the community outside and beyond education, etc., etc., etc. And yet we see a huge change. Today, just like every day, people who count all the stats for us tell me we will be involved with at least 150,000 different people, the same people. Wow. That we know. There are others, but we are working with around England, let alone in any other country. We're working with 150,000 people today who know us, who we know them well, who volunteer with us. Some of them now work for us. We support them, they support us. We do this work together.
Now, you founded Oasis in 1985. You must have a lot of stories and experiences with this work.
Endless stories, mostly about my failure. Because what happens in life is you learn through getting it wrong, don't you? That's how real learning happens. It doesn't happen from reading a textbook. That can help. But real learning, I've always felt, happens when you get your hands dirty, when you get involved. Real learning is hard won, and it's won out of the experience of something. So yeah, there's just endless stories about things I've got wrong and things I've learned from. I sometimes think it's a miracle that Oasis, as it's grown, hasn't sacked me and got rid of me because of all the mistakes made along the way. But as I say, it seems to me there's not much option but to learn from mistakes. I think that the biggest lesson I've learned probably is this, that when you have a vision, you will be frustrated. People often come and tell me how frustrated they are. And I say to them, that's a good thing. It means you've got a vision. And likewise, I say to people who've not, I say to people, are you frustrated in your job, in the task you've got, in the thing you spend most of your time doing? Do you find it frustrating? And then I say, because if you don't, you should stop and hand it over to somebody who is frustrated, because vision and frustration are the same thing. What is vision? It's longing for and hoping for and planning for and dreaming of and praying about something that you really want to happen. That's vision. What is frustration? It's longing for and hoping for and praying for and yearning for something you really want to happen that isn't yet. Vision and frustration fit together. I've learned that thing along the way.
Now, you've written a new book, A Manifesto of Hope. What's the book about?
It's 10 principles, actually. A manifesto for hope, 10 principles for transforming the lives of children, young people, and their families. And I wrote the book because back in the end of 2021, the last couple of days, actually, on the eve of New Year's Eve, heading into 2022, a tragedy happened about 7 o'clock in the evening. one of the children, a teenager in one of our schools, was murdered. He was stabbed in a park. It was such a tragic happening. And I heard about it later that evening. And then I woke up the next morning and I got a call from somebody else who's part of the Oasis team. And they told me that in a completely different town, hundreds of miles apart, both in England, but hundreds of miles apart, a young boy called Dylan, a 5-year-old, had been found by police murdered by his mother at home. And those 24 hours, or even 12 hours actually, really rocked me. And I sat down and I asked myself, how, if our goal as Oasis is to build healthy communities where everyone can thrive and achieve their God-given potential, how had we failed in those two situations? I'm sure we fail in others as well. And I began to look at some of the reasons why that had happened. And in both communities, we'd asked for resources. In one community, in fact, the boy that was murdered, he was murdered in a park. And 9 years earlier, we'd asked the local authority for an big empty building there. So we said, why don't you loan it to us and we turn it into a youth club? So we make this park safe. Park was unsafe. And to cut a long story short, they refused to do so. I don't mean aggressively, the muddle of bureaucracy, the whole thing just got lost and never happened. I realised that if that youth club had been open, which was still standing empty, that old building, that would have been a different outcome. And Dylan, the young lad that was murdered by his mum, this came at the end of the lockdowns in England. We'd had several lockdowns because of COVID. And his mum lived on a poor housing estate alone and had been robbed of another Christmas and any social context. And the mental health, the emotional and social toll on a person's well-being is huge, isn't it? And once again, we'd asked for money from local government to support the work that we were doing in the community. And the money was there actually, but often money is poorly spent, isn't it? Or it's not spent, or it's spent on bureaucracy and form filling rather than on building relationships. So I wrote the book out of that, a manifesto for hope, and it's 10 principles that I've learned over the 4 decades of running Oasis that I think would contribute to more successful community building and do contribute when they're allowed to.
Who is the book aimed at?
It's aimed at everyone. In fact, I've written, I don't know how many books, it's about 60 or so. I think I lose count. Across the years, I've written so many books. And many of those have been very specifically aimed at Christian community, at churches, at Christian leaders. But a manifesto for hope, I intentionally saying it, this is for everyone. It's for church leaders and church members. It's for local grassroots organisation members and leaders, local charities, community groups. It's for policymakers. It's for politicians. It's for business leaders. It's for anyone who's any individual, any group who's interested in our common task, our most important task of transforming the lives of young people and children and the families that they're part of.
And of course, you've got nearly 40 years of practical experience, haven't you?
Well, yeah, 40 years of practical experience, I hope. Someone once said to me that the problem is that if you don't reflect on your experience, instead of having 40 years of practical experience, you end up with 1 year of practical experience 40 times because you never learn your lessons. And that's true, isn't it? Have an experience to reflect on that experience, to theorize about how you can do things differently because of that experience, to do things differently, to learn from that experience, to reflect on it. That cycle creates it's a continuous cycle of learning, isn't it? And I hope that that's what Oasis is. It certainly is that when we're at our best. But like every institution, every movement, I'm not here to tell you that Oasis is the bee's knees. Oasis is a band of people together who want to bring God's kingdom, and we're working away at it.
Who do you have recommending the book?
Well, a ton of people recommended it. But on the front cover, they put one of my best friends. His name's Mark Russell, and he's the head of the Children's Society, which was set up by the Church of England a long, long time ago. And he's the CEO of that. And I really trust him because they work with children around England every single day. But all sorts of people put their name to it. In fact, I asked Tony Blair, former Prime Minister, if he'd write a quote from me, and he did. I'm looking at a copy of the book now, and it says this important book sets out vital steps for government, civil society, and key stakeholders to create integrated care for our young people. I got to know Tony Blair because back when he was Prime Minister, we'd been running schools for children in slum communities in India. I'm partly Indian, I'm half Indian, half English. And we'd been running schools in some African countries, but we'd never had the opportunity of running them in the UK. We worked in schools, we did work with children that were at risk of falling out of education. But when Blair's government came into power, as they say, he had an initiative whereby organisations with track record in working with young people could become responsible for schools that were struggling or failing. And we were given the opportunity of doing that. That's how we first came to run schools in England. And as I say, we now run 54 of them and have taken on more all the time. So that created a bit of a bond with Tony Blair when he was in office. And I've kept that friendship throughout and asked him to read the book and if he liked it, write something. And he did.
Do we need a bigger focus on family and family values today, do you think?
I think, yes, we need a bigger focus on family and family values. We need, I think, though, to understand that not all families are the same shape. I, as a kid, went to church. I kind of rejected church. And then, I told you the story about how I started going back to the youth group because of this girl, Mary Hooper, and became a Christian myself. But reflecting on my childhood, perhaps it wasn't quite like, I'm sure it wasn't like this, but everything in our church, when I used to go with my mum and dad, my two sisters and my brother on a Sunday as a child, everything was neat. There was always Mr. and Mrs. and their 3 children or their 2 children. Everybody sat in the same pew, each week. There were the Suitors and the Tringhams. I can still remember all their names. And we were the Chalks and, the Dowwoods, another family. Everybody was neat and tidy and in their best dress and all the rest of it. And I've subsequently learned that life is really messy, isn't it? Things go wrong, relationships break down, stuff doesn't turn out the way we want. I am a Baptist minister and I've married so many couples, hundreds of them across the years. And I've seen some of those marriages thrive and some of those marriages fail. I've seen tragic things happen in some of those families. And yet there's always hope. And that seems to me to be the gospel. That seems to me to be the good news that God is love. God is love for all, unconditional, immeasurable love. And so when we say family values have a real place, I think we have to be very careful about saying that does not mean, one mum, one dad, 3 kids and a dog, or whatever it is, and that's the ideal. I think that God's love embraces all, including you, including me, at any stage we are in life. And I think those values of love, of grace, of openness, of togetherness, of building community. In fact, as much as I want to talk about family values, and I do, I think we should talk about community values. And I think I would say this: human beings are relational beings. We are made for community. We thrive when we're in community and we struggle when we're not. And so the work of Oasis is always on building communities where everyone, as I've said, is valued and everyone can achieve their God-given potential.
What is your prayer for the book?
My prayer for the book, I wrote it. It came out probably 9 months before the general election in this country, which we've just had. And I wrote it specifically, as I said, for all leaders in all walks of life, because I know that we can't carry on the way we are at the moment. I know that things need to change. I know that the depth and the quality of any community isn't measured by its number of millionaires. Instead, it's measured by the inclusion it creates for every child, for the acceptance it creates for every child. I know that these are the real measures of life and quality of community. So I wrote it with these 10 principles in mind that would form a manifesto for hope is what it's called. In fact, there is a 10-point manifesto in the back of the book. And unlike the book I wrote before, it's called The Lost Message of Paul. It's a theology book. It's probably the biggest theology book I've ever written about Paul's theology and inclusion. And but that was written for the church, obviously, and it's sold in Christian bookstores and on websites and all the rest of it, as you'd expect, Amazon and all the rest. But I was really pleased that the Manifesto for Hope was sold at the political conferences last year, and it really has informed some of the policy thinking. And indeed, this week, today, next week, last week, I'm engaged now in working with government as a voice into government about how we set in place policies that meet the ends that I talk about in the book. And of course, setting up projects, because I think that in the end, government's surrounded by lots of people who do lots of talking. Everybody's got a view on how life should be, but it's the guys that do something, that get their hands dirty, that roll up their sleeves, that I think get listened to more. And Oasis is on the front line of things. So just after I've spoken with you, I'm off. I'm getting on public transport. I'm going down to a brand new project that we're just setting up and opens next Monday. And it's about working with young people who've fallen out of education, who get involved in crime and gangs. And it's about working with them. So I'm able to speak, or we're able to speak into government, not just based on the principles in my book, but the fact that these principles are put to work in this place. Come and see. That's what happens.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more about Oasis, and how can people get a hold of your book?
Well, our website for Oasis is Oasis UK. Once you go to Oasis UK, you can also get to the websites of our other countries. But oasisuk.org, simple. Oasis UK, one word, .org. You can get a hold of my book, A Manifesto for Hope, I think through all of those book-selling websites there are around the world. It's on them all. I think you can order it through Oasis UK as well. So there you are, one address, Oasis UK.
Well, Steve, thank you very much for sharing today.
Thank you, Paul. It's been great. It's really great talking to you. God bless you in the situation you're in and the work that you're doing, which is so important.